Hello, good afternoon.
Morning.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. We should be getting started pretty soon. Chris is going to walk us through this training. So,
Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Christopher Diaz, the city attorney. We're just at about 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and start the training. Waiting to ask anybody who's joining us on the actual Zoom to go ahead and mute yourself. And we'll talk about how questions and answers could be asked as we get into the presentation. But with that, I know we have a lot of commission members on, a lot of council members, as well as staff, and so I'm excited to walk you guys through the Brown Act. I will say that teaching the law is not one of the most exciting things in the world. So there are some ways today that we are going to make it a little more exciting. So hopefully it keeps us all awake and keeps us all alert on the topic at hand, because this is an important topic that really does govern how we deal with the public and how we bring the public into the work that we do every day at the city. So just some housekeeping tasks. The first thing, this is a special meeting for commissions and councils because we do have a majority joining us today. So we do have to take public comment. On the public city website, we do have this information listed, and then we'll give it about 30 seconds to see if we have any public comments coming in, but we'll just wait a minute to see if we have any roll in. And I would just ask staff to just check to make sure we have no public comments, and if not, we'll go ahead and proceed with the training.
Chris?
Yes, Councilmember.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, since this is a special city council meeting, are we going to take rolls so we know? I can't see anybody yet. In this format, I can't see who's here. So is it, do we have a majority? So it's an actual meeting. If not, we're just going to proceed like a training for the council is all I'm asking about.
Yeah, my understanding is staff will verify who's been in attendance, and so we'll determine if there was a majority. But either way, we are going to proceed with the training. We really did the agenda out of an abundance of caution, but our understanding is we do have a majority of the council attending today.
So does that mean we're not taking attendance like we would normally do at any regular or special meeting? You're just going to tell us at some point in time?
Yes, staff is going to verify who was in attendance today.
right now, this is Ashwini. Right now, we have the mayor and vice mayor, so we only have two. And we could have others join, but Chris, I didn't think we needed to take attendance. We just wanted to make sure it was publicly noticed in case there was a majority.
Correct. And if a majority is here, we want the public to know what the majority of the council is hearing and seeing. And so that is the purpose for the agenda today.
Okay. Hello, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Bill Chwan. As part of the planning commission, we were asked to, attendance verification was something we needed. So is this something we could just go into this webinar chat and just let them know that we were there?
Yes, that works perfect. I think just let staff know that you are present, and we'll go ahead and note that.
Okay. I just want to say hi, good morning. It looks like my microphone's working.
Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning, Vice Mayor. And looking forward to your Brown Act training this morning, Chris. Go ahead.
Perfect.
Me too. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We have about an hour and 15 minutes and an hour and a half allocated. So I just want to raise that point so that we stay on task. And then if we do have questions, I want to be able to answer some of those today. So I don't think we have any public comments, so we'll go ahead and proceed. So this is the aspect that I'm trying to make a little more lively, I think, for today. We're going to scroll down, and for those of you who recall the David Letterman show, the Tonight Show, the top 10 list, interspersed throughout this presentation is the top 10 list of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say about the Brown Act. So we'll start with 10 and we'll work our way down to 1, but that will hopefully keep this a little more lively and fun. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. Obviously, the purpose of the Brown Act, why do we have it in place and why do we have to follow it? Application of the law, who does it apply to and when does it apply? We'll also cover serial meetings, and we're going to spend a substantial amount of time on the serial meeting portion because it is an area with the rise of social media as well as the electronic communications. It is an area that creates a lot of issues in terms of the Brown Act. We'll also talk about the rules that actually govern meetings once we're in a meeting. We'll also talk about violations of the law and what that means and kind of the procedures in the Brown Act to cure violations. We'll also talk about the pandemic and what the governor did to the Brown Act in regards to the pandemic. And then finally, we'll do a question and answer. We do ask that if you do have questions to submit, there is a Q&A feature versus a chat feature. And so please use that Q&A feature and we'll read out those questions as we get to the end. And to the extent that I can answer those questions on the presentation, I will do so. If there's more information that we need, we'll definitely bring back and make sure that everybody can see those questions and answers in some sort of written format. So with that, here's number 10 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say about the Brown Act. And it is, of course, that was a Brown Act meeting. So oftentimes I get asked a question about a social media post, about an email chain, and it's usually after the fact. And someone is worried that there could have been a Brown Act violation. And so if you had posed to me a social media post or an email, and I did respond with this, then there's something to be worried about. So this is not something you want to hear me say in response to something that's happened in the past, because if it was a Brown Act violation, obviously we needed to comply with all the procedural requirements that we'll discuss today, but definitely not something you want to hear me say. So with that, we want to cite directly from the Brown Act. Government Code Section 54950 specifies as follows: the people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. So what does that mean in a nutshell? Obviously, we have elected officials on today. We have appointed officials on today. We have staff on today. And I think all of us are doing good government work. But something that is required is that the public obviously delegates authority to its elected officials. The elected officials are delegating authority to the appointed officials. And then obviously the electeds, as well as our city manager, is hiring city staff to do city work every day. But the public does not give up their right to be a part of that process. And so the Brown Act is really the goal here, is to make sure that the public is involved in every step of the process. And so when we have public meetings, when we conduct that public business, the public has a right to be informed, to be a part of that process. And so that's really what the Brown Act requires in a nutshell. I did want to add that our Milpitas Open Government Ordinance is also applicable here. It is what I call sometimes jokingly the Brown Act on steroids. But it does apply the Brown Act, just with a little more heightened areas of requiring doing more, essentially. So the Open Government Ordinance does require us to do a little bit more in certain nuanced areas, and we'll cover those today. But keep in mind, it also does apply when we're dealing with public meetings and public process. So who does the law apply to? The Brown Act applies to all legislative bodies of a local agency, and we'll talk about what that means in a bit. But one thing to keep in mind, I think, for those of us who are maybe stepping into a new position or may step into a new position as an elected or an appointed, if you get elected to a position, but you're not yet sworn into that position and taken your seat, the Brown Act specifies that it still applies to you as a newly elected position, even if you have not taken your seat on that legislative body. So a good example of this would be the city council. If we were to get a council member stepping in November, they don't get sworn in until December, but for that month of November, the Brown Act does apply to them. So they would want to be very cautious and avoid any majority of that legislative body gathering together, even if they're not officially a part of that body quite yet. So again, who does the law apply to? Every local agency in the state. That would include us as the city of Milpitas. It would also include the local school district, any special district within our territory, the county, but pretty much every public agency in the state of California is governed by the Brown Act. It also applies to any legislative body, and that would mean our governing body, which is our city council. It also includes any boards, commissions, or committees formed by formal action of the governing body. And so what that means is, if the city council was to take some formal action to create another group, whether it be a commission, whether it be a task force, because the council is creating that body and they are essentially asking that body to do a task and come back to report to them, logic is that because the city council is a Brown Act body, if they form a new body to assist them, that body should also be subject to the Brown Act. Now, the Milpitas Open Government Ordinance goes a little bit beyond here in terms of what the Brown Act requires. One good example of this is standing subcommittees versus ad hoc subcommittees. Our city council, as well as I believe our planning commission, do have subcommittees. For the city council, there are standing subcommittees on a variety of topics. Those subcommittees continue on forever. And basically the subcommittee continues to meet to do work on that topic. Under the Brown Act, a standing subcommittee does need to comply with the Brown Act, which means they need to put out an agenda and make sure the public can participate in that subcommittee meeting. Now, a distinction here is ad hoc subcommittees. So an ad hoc subcommittee is a subcommittee formed by the council or by a commission to undertake a singular task. And once that singular task is completed, that subcommittee essentially dissolves, obviously reporting back to the commission or council. But once that task is done, that subcommittee is finished. Now, under the Brown Act, an ad hoc subcommittee does not need to comply with the Brown Act at all. So no agenda is required, no public participation is required. But under our open government ordinance, if we had an ad hoc subcommittee, it is required to comply with the Brown Act. So this is an area where our open government ordinance goes above and beyond, so to speak, and it also details other types of commissions and task forces that are subject to the Brown Act. So the key to the Brown Act is really that all meetings shall be open and public, again, making sure that the public has an opportunity to be a part of that process. But there are exceptions, and there are nuances to what is a meeting and what does it mean to be open and public. And so we'll talk about that next. So again, what is a meeting? When is a meeting not a meeting? So let's talk about some of those exceptions and what a meeting really means. A meeting is any gathering of a majority of the members of a body to basically at the same time and place, even electronically, to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any matter under their jurisdiction. So we've underlined and bolded the three words that are most important in understanding the Brown Act. It doesn't require that action actually be taken by a majority outside of a meeting. In other words, you could just be hearing the same thing together in a majority. A good example of this is the training today. So if we have a majority of the council, a majority of a commission attending, all hearing the same information, because this training is sponsored by the city, it is required that we comply with the Brown Act because that would technically meet the definition of a meeting. Again, it's any collective concurrence of a quorum of the body gathering together to hear, discuss, or deliberate. Now, you may be thinking of other situations you've been in where you may have been with a majority of your commission or council, hearing, discussing, or deliberating things and wondering if that was a violation. We'll talk about some of the exceptions, and there are a number of exceptions, so we'll walk you through those as well. So exceptions, when is a meeting not a meeting? Well, individual contacts. So if you buddy up with another commission member, another council member to talk about a certain topic coming before the commission or council, that is completely allowed. But keep in mind that a serial meeting can happen, and we'll talk about what serial meetings are in a bit. But the short of it is, if you have a buddy that you've kind of buddied up with in terms of the council or commission to talk about a particular topic, the risk is that one of those two members that are discussing the topic could go to a third member and share that information. And that's where a serial meeting can form in violation of the law. But we'll cover that in a few slides. But individual contacts, again, are not a meeting. So you can buddy up with one other commission or council member to talk about a topic, and that is not a problem under the Brown Act. Conferences and seminars. A good example of this is the League of California Cities. I know they host a planning commissioner academy as well as a new council member academy. Those types of conferences, because they are open to the public, anybody could attend. You can attend as a majority with your commission or council a conference of that type. The important thing to remember there is that you attend the conference, you can talk about the conference generally in terms of the topics being presented with your commission or council members. What you would not want to do, however, is talk about city business that's really not on the agenda for the conference with a majority of the council or commission at that conference. Also community meetings. So if an outside group wants to put on a community event or a community meeting about a topic of local concern, a majority of the council, majority of a commission could attend that community meeting, so long as they only talk about that topic at that community meeting amongst each other, and that discussion doesn't get broader than that and cover other types of city business. Purely social or ceremonial occasions. So if there's a retirement celebration for a staff member, if there's a birthday party for an official, that you can attend in a majority with your commission or council, that type of an event. Again, the reminder here is that you would not want to discuss city business as part of that event, but enjoy the social aspect, enjoy the ceremonial aspect. Just don't take it further than that and start to discuss city business. Attendance at standing subcommittee meetings. And so for our subcommittee meetings, they are comprised of either 2 commissioners or 2 council members. When you have a subcommittee meeting, a third member who's not a member of that subcommittee may want to attend. And that is allowed under the Brown Act. Now, the big caveat here is that if you are that third member that's attending, that is not a member of the subcommittee, you want to be mindful of sitting in the audience, not interacting, not participating, because as soon as you start interacting with the 2 members or participating in the meeting, there's a risk that that meeting has now become a full commission or full council meeting. So if you attend a subcommittee meeting, you can observe, you can listen, but you would not want to interact with the 2 members. Also, meetings of other legislative bodies. I often get this question, whether it be from planning commission members or city council members, just wanting to attend each other's meetings. And it might be that 3 or a majority rather of that, either the planning commission or city council attend each other's meeting. Now that is allowed, again, so long as there's not that interaction taking place. And you don't want to discuss obviously issues that are not on the agenda for that meeting. But you can attend another legislative body meeting. So that means the city council, if they wanted a majority to attend the planning commission meeting, they could, but they would not want to interact. And I usually caution our city council against attending planning commission meetings because oftentimes there are issues at the planning commission that will end up at the city council. And we want to be mindful of, especially if due process is involved, of not getting involved in the process and staying impartial up until it gets to the city council level. But those are the exceptions that would allow for other types of attendance and doesn't trigger the meeting requirement in the Brown Act. So here's number 9 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say about the Brown Act. That's a Brown Act meeting too. So oftentimes I'll get a hypothetical thrown at me from staff. Well, if we did it this way, would this work? Where we wouldn't have to do an agenda. And oftentimes I have to respond with this, which is that, no, that's a Brown Act meeting too. We do have to comply with the law. So a good example of this is understanding the nuance, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, which is really serial meetings. Serial meetings are prohibited by the law, and what a serial meeting essentially means and the prohibition means is that any use of direct communication, personal intermediaries, or technological devices employed by a majority of the legislative body members in order to develop a collective concurrence as to action to be taken on an item by the body is essentially prohibited. Now we'll break this down a bit, but in essence, a serial meeting could happen because staff's involved. It could happen because of an email chain. It can happen because of a social media post. And these are all the things we want to be very mindful of because this is an area that's really fraught with legal risk in terms of where we are today, especially I think in the pandemic, dealing with a complete and virtual format. So elements of a serial meeting, it's a series of communications between less than a quorum, but taken as a whole involves the majority. And at the end of the day, a concurrence is formed. The classic example of this is kind of the hub and spoke that you're seeing on your screen. Oftentimes where this comes up in terms of case law is a staff member serves as that hub with council members essentially serving as the end of the spokes. And if that staff member in the middle is talking with each council member or commission member, and they then have opinions from each council member or commission member. If they then share those opinions of those other commission members and council members with the other council members or commission members, then you have a potential serial meeting occurring. So that's the classic example, but there's also the daisy chain, and we'll talk about some other examples of where this could be a risk. So the daisy chain example is member A speaks to member B, who then speaks with member C about a particular matter. And in the process, they all form a collective concurrence on a matter. So if you recall, I said individual contacts where you buddy up with one member is allowed. So member A and member B, let's say they buddy up and talk about a particular topic. That is completely fine. Now the risk comes in if one of those members, A or B, decides to have a conversation with a third member. And if they share with that third member kind of the discussion between the two members, then you now have a majority of that body all having the same opinions, or at least hearing the different opinions from each member and potentially developing a collective concurrence outside of a meeting. So that's the major risk. And one way to avoid this is obviously if you do buddy up with somebody and somebody else on the council or commission wants to talk to you about a particular issue, if you've already buddied up with somebody, just respond to that person and indicate to them, really, I've already talked about this with one other member and I want to make sure we're Brown Act compliant. So let's save this discussion for the actual council or commission meeting. And then the hub and spoke, which I mentioned. So again, this is an intermediary, could be a staff member, acting as the hub of a wheel with members relaying information back and forth to each other through that hub. And in the process, again, developing that collective concurrence. And so this is a good example, I think, for staff that works with commissions, that staff that works with the council. If you are doing kind of those individual discussions with commission members or council members, you just want to be mindful of the fact that you don't want to share any opinions you are hearing from those commission members or council members with other members, because that is where that serial meeting could happen. So you can sit down and brief commission members and council members about a particular issue, but avoid taking in those opinions and then sharing them out because that would be a violation of the Brown Act. Again, this is an example of an exception from a serial meeting. Again, this is done mostly with staff where we want to get more information to a commission member or a council member. One-on-one briefings are completely allowed under the law. And so we can sit down with individual council members, individual commission members, brief them on a particular issue that's coming up before the commission or council. And as so long as we're not sharing the viewpoints, the opinions, any comments we're hearing from one member to another member, that would be completely allowed. But staff should just be really mindful here of making sure that when you are sitting down or having discussions individually with a commission or council member, just limit what you're hearing from the other commission members and council members and don't share that with the member you're speaking to. So how can a serial meeting happen? Well, there's a lot of different ways. A personal meeting, obviously, if member A and member B are just having a sit down over coffee, obviously pre-COVID and probably pre-pandemic. But again, if they have a personal meeting and then one of those members goes and talks to a third member in a personal meeting for sit down for coffee, that could lead to a serial meeting. The same thing with the telephone. If somebody picks up the phone and has a conversation with one other member, but that one member then goes and talks to a third member. Email, especially reply all. One of the things I am going to recommend, and there's some best practices we'll talk about in a bit, but if you are a commission or a council member and you want to send out information to your fellow commission or council members, the easiest way to do this is just send it to the staff liaison or for the city council to the city manager. And that will ensure that the information can get out to the commission or council without any risk of an opinion being shared by a commission or council member to that full commission. Written correspondence, this happens, and it's been a topic of case law, where a council wants to send a letter. If that letter is not formed and drafted or approved in an actual open meeting, that would be a violation of the law. The idea is that if a letter is drafted by staff and then we ask all the council members to sign on, that signing on process, that collective concurrence of all council members agreeing to sign that letter, that would be an issue that needs to occur in a public open meeting. So when we're dealing with letters that are going to be sent, we usually as staff provide a draft for the council in their agenda packet or commission packet to see if that's something they want to approve. And if there's wordsmithing done on the dais, that's allowed. But staff would never want to move forward with a letter that's not approved or formed in a public meeting with all council members signing off. And then finally, social networking sites. Obviously, social media is huge now, and it does pose a risk for serial meetings. So Facebook, Twitter, whatever it happens to be, we'll talk a little bit about how that could lead to a serial meeting. So with emails, just some tips I think that would help both staff and council. And we talked a little bit about this in some prior slides. But keep in mind, if you get an email from, whether it be staff, whether it be from a constituent, if they are adding the entire commission or council to that email, resist the urge to reply all. And the reason for that is if you reply all and just say thank you, that is probably okay. But if you reply all and you start stating some opinion about what the topic is, you are then sharing that opinion with the rest of the commission or council. There may be already 2 commission members or council members that have buddied up on that topic. And now they are seeing a third member's opinion, which could lead to that collective concurrence forming. So if you get one of those emails, resist the urge to reply all. The best thing to do is if you want to respond to the constituent or staff, hit just reply. And I always encourage our staff to basically blind carbon copy a commission or a council so that there's not the ability to essentially hit reply all. And then keep in mind that even if you do reply to a constituent, maybe you do want to say thank you for your email, but if you respond with more than that and start adding your opinions, what I've seen happen is that constituent will sometimes, if they don't get the answer they like, they may forward that email from the one council member or commission member to the entire commission or council, and therefore you have an opinion being shared again with the entire commission or council. Now, obviously the commissioner or council member who wrote back the email sharing the opinion didn't intend for that to happen. So it's not an intentional violation of the law, but through that constituent would have assisted with essentially a Brown Act violation. So I think when you respond to constituents, there's always the desire to share more, but keep in mind there's that risk that your email can be forwarded. So it might be better to just say thank you for the email and we'll take that into consideration and leave it at that. So here's some email tips for appointed and electeds as well as staff. If a constituent sends you an email, whether you're an appointed or an elected, the best thing to do, whether it's the full council's on the email or not, again, send that email to a staff liaison if there's staff work to be done, or send it to the city manager if you're the city council asking for some work to be done or an issue to be looked into. Again, resist that urge to hit reply all. And resist that urge to share too much, because again, that email could be forwarded out to the commission or council by a constituent, leading to your opinions being shared with the full commission or council. Staff, obviously, once they get an email from a council member or commission member, we do want to circle back, make sure the full commission or council understands the outcome. If somebody was requesting something from the city or some resource, but that's the general approach I recommend. Obviously, work through staff. If there's something that's being asked of you as a commission or council member, send that email to staff, ask them to take care of it. Respond to the constituent if you like, but resist the urge to share opinions. And then staff will circle back so that you can ultimately share with that constituent what the outcome was. And then email tips for staff. I usually recommend not adding individual commission or council members to an email if you're responding to a constituent. And really that's just on the basis to make sure that the entire commission or entire council has the same information. Because if they don't have the same information, there's that risk that one council member who does have the information wants to then push it out to the rest of the council or commission. And you could have an opinion being shared, the risk of a collective concurrence. So again, if staff is dealing with a constituent, you know a commission or a council member is very interested in the topic, deal with the constituent by email alone. And then after you're done, obviously dealing with the constituent, share what you know with the commission or council as a whole. Make sure that the entire commission or council has the same information, and that'll reduce the risk overall of a commissioner or council member wanting to share more with their fellow commissioners. If a constituent adds individual commission members or council members to an email when they send something to staff, again, here I would recommend that staff remove the commission members and council members when replying. And then again, once the outcome with the constituent is handled, let those commission members or council members know, and let the full commission and council know for that matter. And that will make sure that, again, we reduce that risk that a commission member, a council member wants to share more with their commission or council. Social media. So this is, obviously that's a somewhat outdated computer on the screen, but social media is one of those areas that is fraught with legal risk. And it mostly applies when either a posting is put up where comments are added to a post. But if you ultimately have a majority of a body commenting on a particular post, that does lead itself to have a collective concurrence. And so be aware of the comment section. Overall, what I recommend, and we'll talk about some best practices for social media as well. Keep in mind that if you share opinions as a commissioner, as a council member on Facebook, that's always allowed, but it could lead to the start of a Brown Act violation. And the reason for that is because if you are sharing strong opinions on Facebook, it might lead a fellow council member, a fellow commissioner to want to respond. And then once you have two people engaging in a discussion, all you need is a third member to come in and either like a post or comment on that post or add to that discussion. And right there with a majority involved, you have a Brown Act violation. So keep that in mind and take caution when you're dealing with social media. Obviously, it's a great resource to get information out to constituents. The area where it becomes a little more fraught with risk is obviously the sharing of strong opinions. So a serial meeting hypo, just to give our brains a chance to think about this in action. During a commission meeting, 5 of 7 members frequently look down into their laps. And this would apply, I would say, in pre-pandemic or post-pandemic, because on Zoom, obviously, everyone can see what a commission or council member is doing on screen. But in some instances, when they're looking down into their laps, an audible bell is heard, sounding like a notification from an iPhone. A local reporter later asked if the commissioners violated the Brown Act by sending texts or emails to each other about agency business. Now, the good question is, was the Brown Act violated? I think in this hypothetical, number one, you'd have to assume that there was actually text or emails being exchanged either with fellow commissioners or even with the public about agency business. Now, if that was the case, then I would make the argument that yes, the Brown Act was violated. When you're in an actual meeting, you should not be communicating with your fellow legislative body members through text or email, and you should definitely not be communicating with the public. The idea here is that you're in a public meeting. The public has a right to understand everything that's being transacted in the moment. And so if you are receiving information from a constituent, if you're sharing a text with a council member and talking about a topic, that should all happen in a public setting. And so anytime agency business is being done by email or text during a meeting, to me, that is a Brown Act violation. So be aware of that and really keep those electronic devices to communicate with family and friends, but not necessarily about city business in a city meeting. So another hypo in terms of social media. So you have a blog post, agency or city is seeking a new general manager or city manager. Comment number 1 comes from a board member. We need someone with great communication skills. Comment number 2, also from a board member, and with a high degree of technical knowledge. Comment number 3, also from a board member. Anyone will be better than the last guy. And comment number 4 from a resident, has the Brown Act just been violated? Well, we know we have, let's say it's a 5-member board. You have 3 members all commenting on a post. I think that is a Brown Act violation. Now, on top of that, you also have comment number 3, which from a human resources perspective is not something a board member would want to state about an employee because that also poses risk for the agency in terms of just an employment lawsuit. But either way, with 3 board members all commenting on a blog post, I would take the position that even if they're asking or putting out information, you have that collective concurrence being discussed and formed. And so really that is a Brown Act violation. So again, if you see some council member or commission member posting, resist the urge to add to that and really kind of limit that as best as possible, because otherwise you could have 3 members all commenting on the same post. So in terms of obviously Facebook and likes, here's another example. City posts a Facebook posting about the next budget workshop, and it indicates that the next budget workshop will examine long-term impacts of capital needs. We have a board member who then comments, yes, this must be a priority. Please attend Tuesday's meeting. Board member 2, I agree, top budget priority. Board member 3 replies, me too. Board member 4 then likes board member 1's post. And then you have a vendor chiming in, so please consider us for this work. And a resident finally chiming in saying, we can't afford to pay for this. Our drought surcharge rates are already too high. So what do we think about this post? Obviously, you have a city Facebook post going up. You have 3 board members commenting. You also have a 4th member liking. Now, there's a fair argument that board member 1's comments is really just to encourage people to attend the meeting. So you could probably make an argument that board member 1 and board member 4 really aren't having a true substantive discussion about the topic at hand. It's really just encouraging public participation. But I would argue, the public looking at this, or somebody was opposed to the budget workshop or what was coming up in terms of the budget. You could see a challenge forming on this basis because you essentially have 4 board members, and let's say it's a 5-member board, so you have more than a majority here, all commenting on the same post. So again, resist the urge to comment. Even likes can be perceived as potential communication, so keep all of that in mind. Again, this is a new area of the law in terms of how courts are deciding these issues, but these are basically the areas that we see as the most risk when dealing with social media. So number 8 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney to say about the Brown Act. This is the agenda. So oftentimes I'll step into a meeting, and it's not happened with Milpitas, which is the good thing, but I do work with other cities. And so sometimes I will look at an agenda and just see that it is pretty bare bones. And in those instances, if you hear me say this is the agenda, be worried. But we'll talk about what are the rules governing actual meetings. And so what does apply, what does need to be on the agenda? What do we need to cover in a particular meeting to be Brown Act compliant? So we'll talk about the regular meeting requirements in terms of agenda and posting, the special meeting requirements, the public's right to comment, as well as closed sessions. So for regular meetings, regular meeting is basically a meeting that is at a set time and date that the public has advance notification about. In our instance, Milpitas has regular meetings on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, and those are our regular meeting times. For those meetings, we do have to post the agenda according to the Brown Act 72 hours prior to the meeting. We also have to include the time and location of the meeting. And with obviously the pandemic, we have no location other than a Zoom link. We also have to include a brief general description of each item to be discussed or addressed. We have to provide an opportunity for the comment, or for public comment rather, on non-agenda items. So this is unique for regular meetings where we actually have to allow for not only comment on each agenda item, but also a general public comment period that would allow for the public to comment on anything within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. That would mean that whatever your commission is comprised of, if it's focused on planning issues, they could talk about any kind of planning related topic. For the city council, because the city council is in charge of almost everything policy related at the city, a public comment could be about anything within the subject matter jurisdiction of the city council. And then if your commission obviously deals with recreation or other issues, the general public comment period would be limited to that. Now, keep in mind the Milpitas Open Government Ordinance here does go above and beyond, again, above and beyond what the Brown Act requires. It basically indicates that we also have to put out a preliminary agenda in addition to a final agenda. And so our heightened requirements require that we get that agenda out for the first time the Wednesday before the Tuesday meeting, the Tuesday regular meeting, which means our staff is busy getting something out last night. And then also our agenda gets in final format by the end of the week. For special meetings, we do have a requirement that we post that agenda no later than 24 hours prior to the meeting. And a special meeting is basically any meeting that we want to have that's in addition to our regular meetings. Just like a regular meeting agenda, a special meeting agenda also needs to include the time and location of the meeting. The agenda also must contain a brief general description of each item to be discussed or addressed. And then also, we only need to allow one public comment period, and that's only as to the topic that's on the agenda. So again, there's no need for a general public comment period with regard to a special meeting. The public only has the right to comment on the topic that's on that special meeting agenda. So when we distribute the agenda packet, whether it's to a commission or a council, the Brown Act requires that we get that agenda packet out to the public at the exact same time. And again, this is just getting to the heart of the Brown Act, which is our legislative bodies. Obviously, they do the work in terms of making decisions on policy issues. But again, the public has a right to be a part of that process. And so the Brown Act does specify when we get that agenda packet out to the public, we need to get it out to the majority, or to the body rather, we get it out to the public at the exact same time. Now, if there's distribution of late materials, let's say we do get that agenda packet out within that 72-hour window. If there's additional documents that come in, whether it be from the city that we want to distribute to the commission or council, or whether it's from the public, if those documents come in within that 72-hour window, our obligation as a city is to make those documents available for the public and then to post them on the agency website. Now, if we're at the meeting, and this is more likely to occur pre-pandemic when we're actually in the council chambers, but if we were at a meeting, if somebody was to bring additional copies for the council or the commission to consider, we'd again want to make sure that copies of those documents are available for the public at the meeting if they are controlled by the city. So if we are sending out additional documents at the meeting, we want to make sure the public has them at the exact same time as the legislative body. But if the public is providing documents, our obligation is only to make them available after the meeting. So that is what is required in terms of Brown Act compliance for distribution of late materials. And staff should keep this in mind because this is an area where it becomes very difficult sometimes with documents coming in late, but staff should be mindful to check their inboxes, make sure if documents do come in late that we do have a protocol set up to make sure that we are complying here with the distribution of those late materials. So here's number 7 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say. And unfortunately, I've had to say this fairly recently in terms of public comment. But yes, you have to let them say that. Oftentimes public comment turns in different directions. And so it becomes difficult to cut off some of that public comment because the public does have First Amendment rights. They can even state something that is completely defamatory, and the law would allow them to do so. There's even case law that indicates that public comments can be profane, but if they're connected to political speech. So we haven't had those situations quite yet in terms of Milpitas, but just be aware that the Brown Act does really protect the public's right to speak, and there are very limited instances where we can essentially stop them. So the public's right to comment, again, we talked a little bit about this, but at a regular meeting, the public essentially has the right to address the body on anything within their jurisdiction. So we have to allow that general public comment period. Again, we also have to, for agenda items, allow the public to comment on each agenda item, either before or during the body's consideration of that item. And then again, for special meetings, members of the public only have the right to address the body about what is listed on the agenda. So number 6 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say. Okay, let's clear the room. The Brown Act does allow for limited instances where we can clear the room if there is an actual disruption. So we'll talk about what that looks like and what that means. For willful interruptions, so we can remove somebody if truly they willfully interrupt the proceedings. But keep in mind, it really needs to be a disruption of the meeting. In other words, if a person is standing up at public comment, they've had their 3 minutes, they're not moving on, and they keep talking, and after repeated requests to stop, they don't stop, and they are literally disrupting the ability for us to move on with city business, there may be an opportunity there to eject that person from the meeting. Now, if this was ever to be a case and a chair of a commission or a mayor, for example, was considering doing this, I would ask that either that chair or that mayor obviously consult with legal counsel, consult with the city attorney's office, talk to your staff liaison, because this is an area also fraught with legal risk. If you would eject somebody from a meeting, you want to make sure it's basically justified by the law, because there is a lot of case law on this topic in terms of people being ejected from meetings, people filing lawsuits against the agency. And so if this was ever to be considered, I would just ask that city attorney's office be consulted. Keep in mind that if somebody's being rude, disparaging, defamatory, and even profane in some instances, we can't remove that person for that unless they're actually, again, disrupting the meeting. What I have recommended, I think, to the council in the past is if we want to address some of these issues that are popping up at public comment, the best way to do that is to have rules of decorum and really redirect the public speaker if they are going in a negative direction. The mayor and the chair is always free to lightly interrupt a speaker if they are going off in terms of a negative direction. If we have a rule adopted, and I don't think many of our commissions or our councils have a rule adopted, but if we did have a rule adopted, rules of decorum, this could be a tool to use to kind of redirect that public comment. Now, this is easier to do, obviously, if we have live speakers, whether we are in the council chambers pre-pandemic, or if there's ever a time in the future where we do allow for people to come on the Zoom to interact with the legislative body. If they are speaking, it's much easier to redirect. If we're getting an emailed comment, there's really no way to redirect that. So, but keep in mind that for the Brown Act, if we wanted to actually eject somebody from a meeting, again, it needs to be a true disruption. It needs to stop the ability for that body to do business. And that is the only basis to eject somebody from a meeting. Rules governing meetings generally, the public does have the right to audio or videotape a meeting. We do this as routine course for the city, and those are made available publicly. But if somebody wanted to come into, let's say, when we were in the council chambers, or if somehow there's a way for them to record a Zoom from their end on their computer, we would have to allow that. The public has the right to record every meeting that we have, unless there's some finding that the body makes that that recording causes a persistent disruption of the proceedings. An example would be, you know, somebody brought in a video camera that had the brightest light possible and it was blinding to the members that are having the meeting. That might be a basis to make a finding. Or if there was a recorder that was making a loud sound that was basically disrupting the ability for the council to, or the commission to do business, that might be a basis to make a finding. But again, if somebody was to come in with an audio or video recorder, we should allow them to do so unless there is some disruption associated with that. Keep in mind that recordings of public meetings are public records. Under the Brown Act, if we do as a city record the meeting, it's a 30-day requirement to retain. After that, it can be destroyed, but keep in mind that we have different procedures set up in our records retention schedule as a city. And so our records retention schedule will govern. But the Brown Act does allow us to destroy meeting videos after 30 days, but I understand that we keep our recordings much longer for the city. And then the Milpitas Open Government Ordinance again indicates that for our meetings, regular, special, closed session, everything is recorded. For regular meetings, we obviously do that and post those videos, as well as for special meetings. For closed session meetings, because that is confidential, those recordings are retained with the city attorney's office. In terms of an agenda, now there are situations, and I've been asked this before, is there an ability to add something to the agenda after the agenda has been posted? So if we're within that 72-hour window or 24-hour window for a special meeting or 72 for regular, there's only two situations where you can add an item to the agenda. One would be in an emergency situation, which does require that you make public health, safety, welfare findings. Now, obviously with the pandemic, with the fires, with 2020 in general, there's a fair argument that this emergency kind of situation or addition probably could have worked if we were really in dire straits and going into a meeting. And let's say the state shutdown hit as we were about to go into a meeting within that 72-hour window. If we needed to add something to the agenda to deal with that state shutdown, we probably could have made the finding for public health, safety, welfare, obviously dealing with the pandemic. The second way is to basically add something by a 2/3 vote, which is 4 out of the 5 if you have a 5-member body, because of an immediate need or immediate action that needs to be taken that came to the agency's attention after the agenda was posted. So what this means is, let's say, for example, the agenda gets posted. Within that 72-hour window, the city's alerted to something that the county needs, and the county's requesting city's immediate action. And the immediate need is maybe associated with not necessarily an emergency situation, but something that just needs to get completed, or we're going to lose out as a city on major funding from the state or federal government. In this situation, it's likely that there could be justification, so long as, again, that issue came to the attention of the entire agency, not just to the council, not just to staff, but the entire agency after the agenda was posted. So if this is just new information coming to light within that 72-hour window to the entire city, and there's a need to take immediate action, then this could work. And keep in mind, a finding is required, and it does require that 4 out of the 5 commission or council members add it. I will say with both of these situations, again, because they are fraught with risk, that legal counsel be consulted, the city attorney's office be contacted if there is a desire to ever use any of those two situations. So what can be done at a meeting if it's not on the agenda? Well, the Brown Act does allow for brief responses to statements or questions from the public. So again, if under public comment, the public is commenting, and let's say for whatever matter or reason, a commission member or a council member just wants to respond to that comment, they are allowed to do so, so long as it is a brief response. You would not want to get into an elongated discussion. You would not want to get into a discussion with your fellow commission or council members. Again, it should be an individual brief response to the public comment. Questions to staff for clarification of matters, again, based upon public comment. So if someone under public comment asks a question of the council or commission requesting some information, it is allowed for a commission member or a council member to essentially direct that question to staff. And if staff wanted to briefly respond, they are allowed to do so. What staff would not want to do is pull out a presentation, get into a 20-minute discussion, because that would be in violation of the Brown Act. Now, again, brief responses are always allowed. So if a commission member or council member wanted to direct a question to staff because of a question posed at public comment, that is allowed. And then staff could either answer the question briefly or just indicate to the body that they will come back with information or share information by email in the future. Brief announcements or reports on a council member or a commissioner or even a staff's kind of activities at the city level. Again, this is allowed, and on our city council agendas, for example, we do include an announcement section, and that allows the council to make brief announcements about particular topics of community concern. Excuse me, one thing to keep in mind though is with the open government ordinance, again, this is a nuance with our local ordinance. It does specify that if the legislative body, for whatever reason, reduces public comment time down, and our standard time as a city is 3 minutes, if that time is reduced down, let's say to example, to 2 minutes, the announcements portion for the council or the commission for that matter, needs to also be limited to that exact same time. So what that means is each council member, each commission member, if they're going to make an announcement, it should be limited to the exact same time period that the public was limited to. And this is a positive thing in my opinion, because ultimately the public wants to be heard. We're giving them the right to be heard. But then if council also wants to be heard on something really not on the agenda, we ask that they take the same amount of time to make that announcement. Keep in mind the city council also has something unique under their announcements section, which is future agenda items. The future agenda items is not governed by the same time limit, but it is subject to a limit, which I've shared with the council based on case law. Keep in mind, you can also provide references or information to staff. So if council or commission essentially has some information, they want to share it with staff and they want to make sure that the public knows that they're sharing it. It is allowed for a commission member or a council member to basically briefly say, I have some information that I've collected from one of my other meetings. I think it's important information for our city staff to have, and I want to pass it on here and have them report back to us on what is contained within that information. And that would be completely allowed. And then finally, asking staff to report back at a future meeting. Again, if there's a question under public comment or the council or commission for that matter just wants more information on a particular topic, and it's not on the agenda, they can briefly ask staff to report back at a future meeting, and that would be okay under the Brown Act. So this is a somewhat newer area of the law within the Brown Act, and we are practicing this as a city from my understanding in terms of dealing with bilingual speakers. But yes, if we have a bilingual speaker who requires translation, the requirement in the Brown Act is to acknowledge the amount of time it takes to essentially translate something being spoken. And so under public comment, if we provide 3 minutes, someone should be able to speak for 3 minutes in their native language. And then from there, the translation can happen, which normally would likely take the same amount of time. And so our obligation as a city is to make sure that that bilingual speaker gets double the amount of time that an English speaker would get. So number 5 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say. You really can't do that in closed session. So again, this is also a question I get often. Can we do this in closed session? There's advantages to closed session because there's more frank discussion that can happen. It's obviously protected communication. And so there's always a desire when there's something complex or where there's liability risk to want to talk about that in closed session. But the Brown Act really does limit how often and essentially what is required for us to get into closed session. So I always state, when I get that hypothetical, let me look at that. Let me make sure that we can do that in closed session. But there are times when I have to indicate you really can't do that in closed session. So what is involved with closed sessions under the Brown Act? Well, they all are confidential, so keep that in mind. And this really is more so at the city council level. I would argue that the Planning Commission, if they ever had an issue coming before them where they were final decision and there was some extreme legal risk, I'd also believe you can justify a closed session for the Planning Commission. But where there's legal risk and where there's final action, that is usually the location where you can essentially allow for a closed session. So keep in mind the closed sessions have to be expressly authorized by the law. So we are limited to what the Brown Act allows us to do. It must be briefly described in the agenda. If we don't describe what that closed session is on the agenda, we do have to verbally announce certain things at certain times. And then keep in mind that if we are in closed session and there's action taken, and action taken is defined by the Brown Act, we may need to report out that action of the council. This is fairly limited. Oftentimes when we come out of closed session, you hear me say there's nothing legally required to be reported out of closed session. And that's usually because direction is given to staff, but there really is no formal action under the Brown Act that needs to be reported out of closed session. There's a number of closed sessions authorized by the Brown Act, but I wanted to cover kind of the most pertinent ones that you may see more often on agendas. One of those is real property transactions. Another one is litigation, whether it be existing, anticipated, or the initiation of litigation. Personnel issues, dealing with appointment, performance, evaluation, discipline, dismissal, or release. And keep in mind, personnel issues are really limited to the city council as they're the only body with actual employees. And then all other employees within the city are obviously within the jurisdiction of the city manager. But the council does have the opportunity to discuss personnel issues in closed session. Also labor negotiations. Obviously the city has a number of bargaining groups. In order for the council to retain their kind of negotiation position, the Brown Act does allow for labor negotiations to be discussed in closed session. And finally, threats to public services or facilities. The Brown Act allows where there is a threat to some sort of facility that the city has for that to be discussed in closed session. I've used this closed session to justify an active shooter training for another jurisdiction where the active shooter training really did turn on where council members essentially could run or hide within a council chamber. And it was important that we do that in closed session because at the end of the day, we did not want any potential person that would be engaging in an active shooter situation to know where the safe spots were or the recommended exit routes were for the council and for the staff. For closed sessions, the Brown Act does give us safe harbor language to use on each agenda. So what that means is that we do follow that language as close as we can. If we use that language that's given in the Brown Act to agendize our closed sessions, that means that we cannot be sued on that basis. The Brown Act provides that language to prevent lawsuits against agencies, and so long as we use that language generally, we are safe from potential lawsuits. Keep in mind that closed sessions do require specific wording. If it's litigation, we may have to detail, let's say if it's anticipated litigation, we may have to detail kind of the facts and circumstances that may lead to litigation. And it all turns on where that threat is coming from. There is new case law that came down just last year that indicates that if you have basically a written threat in some form, that written threat, whether it comes from a law firm, whether it comes from an outside individual, that threat should really be listed on the agenda, as well as the document that contains that threat be part of the agenda so that the public understands where that threat is coming from. Now that doesn't apply in every instance, but it does apply in certain instances. And so that's something that to be aware of, obviously, if you're dealing with a closed session you want to consult with the city attorney pretty closely to make sure that that language is proper and it is using the safe harbor provisions. So number 4 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say. You can't do that in closed session either. So again, I may get a question about, can we do this in closed session? Well, and I say no. And then maybe there's another question about, well, what if we did it this way? And so if I respond with this, then it may be disappointing to you, which generally means we're doing it in open session. So common challenges for closed sessions. We talked about real estate negotiations being an allowed closed session. But keep in mind, the state attorney general has basically said for real estate negotiations, the only topics that can be discussed in closed session dealing with a real estate purchase or sale is price and terms of payment only. What this means is that if, let's say a council wanted to talk about buying a particular property or selling a particular property, and in terms of buying a property, they wanted to discuss, what is the idea that we'd like to see on that site? What do we want to build as a city? And if they're selling property, there may be a question about what do we do with the proceeds of that sale? All of that discussion needs to happen in open session. The state attorney general has said the only thing that is relevant or important to protect in a closed session dealing with real estate negotiations is really price in terms of payment. And that's really the negotiation aspect of a real estate deal, is how much you're going to pay. What are the terms? Is it 30-day escrow, 15-day escrow? That stuff can be talked about in closed session because those are the true negotiation points. But anything beyond that, it needs to happen in open session. Keep in mind that for personnel issues, obviously, again, council is the only one that really has employees to have closed sessions for personnel related issues. But one of the nuances here that I just wanted to talk about a little bit, and one of my other jurisdictions actually had this set up, and it made it somewhat difficult for both me as legal counsel as well as for the city council. But in the instance in my other jurisdiction, they had a police chief with a direct contract approved by the city council. That meant the city council always amended that contract, always determined the compensation, and they did so in closed session under a conference with labor negotiator closed session, which allows them to talk about money, compensation, as well as the terms in the contract. Now, they approved the contract, the council, as well as approved the salary, but the employment, the hiring and firing, excuse me, of the chief was completely under the jurisdiction of the city manager. So going into closed session with the council to talk about money was often very difficult because they wanted to get into that discussion about evaluation, about performance, but really that had been delegated to the city manager. And so it became very difficult for them and keeping that topic not under their purview. And so this is an area where I usually don't recommend going this approach because it does create a lot of issues. But just keep that in mind that this is a setup that some cities do use today. Finally, who can attend a closed session? Really, the state attorney general has weighed in on this as well. And what they've indicated is that if somebody is instrumental or needed for that legislative body to talk about a closed session, they can be in the room. But what we would not want to do is just have extra staff in the room that really isn't adding to the discussion. Because the logic with that is if you add additional people that really aren't required to be there, there's an argument you're opening it up to the public because at that point you have people in that room that are not necessary. Keep in mind that when you're dealing with conference with legal counsel, whether it be anticipated litigation, existing litigation, the Brown Act, as well as the state attorney general has said that you need a lawyer in that room discussing the legal topic with the counsel. In other words, if staff was in the room walking the counsel through a legal issue, that would not be allowed. And so if that closed session was agendized as conference with legal counsel and there was no lawyer in that room or on the phone, that closed session would be improper. And I apologize if there's some background noise. My gardeners have decided to do some blower work outside as we are presenting. So they'll pass shortly. So I apologize about the background noise. The one thing to keep in mind with closed sessions is they are confidential. So if the council or if you're a staff member that gets invited into that closed session room, everything you acquire, everything you learn in that closed session room is confidential, which means you cannot divulge that confidentiality to anybody else that was not in the room. For the closed sessions that are dealing with legal topics, there's an attorney in the room. which means those, not only is that communication in that room confidential under the Brown Act, it's also attorney-client privileged. As a city council, if they're hearing attorney-client privileged information, any one council member essentially can't break that privilege. It needs to be the entire body deciding to divulge privileged or confidential information. So keep that in mind if you are a city council member, if you do get elected to city council. The things to keep in mind here is that, again, you as an individual cannot divulge that information. It needs to be an action taken by the entire body. So number 3 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say about the Brown Act, the district attorney called, we need to talk. So this is definitely not something I ever want to say, or do I ever want to have my clients hear. But there are certain instances where the district attorney will step in when there is a Brown Act violation. So going back to closed session confidentiality, obviously if there is a disclosure of confidential information acquired in closed session, for an employee, that could lead to disciplinary action. If you're a member of the legislative body, it could lead to a referral to the grand jury. It could lead to a referral to the district attorney's office. It's really at the discretion of the legislative body as to what they want to do if information is divulged from closed session, but these are all options that are available. Now, if there is an alleged violation of the Brown Act in open session based on action, whether it be a commission or a council took, there are certain types of actions under the Brown Act that can never be invalidated. Those would be actions taken in substantial compliance with the law, actions dealing with the sale or issuance of notes, bonds, or other indebtedness. And keep in mind, this is the idea that the Brown Act bends to other areas of the law here. So that if there are a sale or issuance of notes or bonds, obviously that is a quite complex process. And so the Brown Act here does bend if there is an issue to allow that to proceed because of the contractual arrangements that have then been set up. Again, the third area is those creating a contractual obligation. So if you've awarded a contract by competitive bid, again, the Brown Act bends here and basically says if a contract hasn't been awarded by competitive bid, but there was some error in the procedural process, the Brown Act says that cannot be invalidated. Those connected with the collection of any tax, again, this is an area where the Brown Act bends. And then finally, those in which the complaining party had actual notice at least 72 hours prior to the regular meeting or 24 hours prior to the special meeting. So what this means is that if there is actual notice that is received, even if there's some error in the process, ultimately, if the public had the proper notice, then the action that was taken could proceed or not be invalidated, rather. Finally, there are ways to cure Brown Act violations. If there was ever a suggestion or an allegation that a commission, council violated the Brown Act, there are two things that need to happen for somebody to challenge that. One, they would need to send in a cure or correct demand to the body, indicating we think you did something incorrect, and offering the opportunity for the agency to correct that issue. So what I usually recommend if an agency does receive a cure and correct letter is just do it over, because at the end of the day, when you get that cure or correct demand, that is a precursor to a lawsuit. And even if we think we did everything correct, unless there's some monumental reason why we don't want to have to do it over, doing it over generally prevents litigation and it reduces costs for the agency. And really the only thing the agency would be out if they did it over is essentially time. And staff time to kind of put together another hearing on that matter. So that is usually my recommendation every time to a city. Obviously, we're dealing with public resources, and if somebody's upset about something that transpired at a meeting, even if we think we are correct, I still recommend that it be done over to avoid that costly litigation that could then proceed. Besides a cure and correct demand, another option for somebody who's upset or just believes that something happened at a meeting that was improper under the Brown Act, they can send in a cease and desist letter. It's basically a letter asking the agency to unconditionally commit to not do that action again, whatever the allegation may be. If an agency does respond with an unconditional commitment to essentially cease and desist from the allegation, even if they don't agree with what's being alleged, essentially if somebody wanted to sue the agency on that basis, That response letter, that unconditional commitment, it basically ensures that the agency, if they are sued, they can get that action dismissed with prejudice, which means that the party that's filing the suit, the lawsuit would be dismissed and they could not file it again. So again, that's protection for the agency. And if my agency was to ever get a cease and desist letter, rather, I might take the same course of action with a cure and correct, which is to go ahead and send the unconditional commitment. It's just a letter. And ultimately in that letter, we can say we disagree with the allegations if we believe we are correct. But ultimately responding with that letter protects the agency. Now, if there was a violation of the Brown Act and we did see a lawsuit, what are the options for a court? What are the options for somebody who's wanting to challenge the city? They can seek essentially an injunction to stop the action from going forward. They can also ask the court to invalidate the action. So if there's a vote taken and an action is proceeding, they could ask the court to stop that, to invalidate it, to make it, to require the agency to essentially do it over. And a court can also mandate correction. So a court might indicate, we're not going to invalidate the action, but city, we are asking you to go back and do a do-over. Now, keep in mind that whenever there's litigation brought under the Brown Act, if a plaintiff does prevail, which means they succeed arguing to a court that there was a violation of the law, they get attorney's fees, which is one of the main reasons I usually recommend. If you get that cure and correct demand, if you get that cease and desist letter, just respond as required under the Brown Act. It will insulate the agency from any subsequent lawsuit. And if a lawsuit is filed, we can get it dismissed with prejudice, which means we're not paying attorney's fees out and there's no plaintiff that would be successful because we've responded as required by the law. Now, if any individual, whether it be a commission member, a council member, a staff member, if they intentionally violate the Brown Act, if you understand the Brown Act and you decide as an individual, I don't care what it requires, I'd rather just share this information out of closed session, I'd rather just communicate with the majority of my commissioners, even if we're not in a meeting. If you intentionally do that, there could be a violation, which is criminal in nature, which is a misdemeanor. So please keep that in mind. Obviously, again, the Brown Act is designed to make sure that we are active participants hand in hand with the public. And so I hope through this training, you understand the importance of the Brown Act, why it's needed, and why it's a good thing ultimately for cities and the public to be able to work hand in hand together. So I would hope we would never have an intentional violation of the law. Number 2 of the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say about the Brown Act. Do we really have to go over this again? So oftentimes the law is complex and I'll give an answer, and sometimes it's hard to digest, and I'll admit that because the law is not an easy area. So sometimes you may hear me say this, do we have to go over this again? Because I want to make sure it's understood. And I'm more than happy to go over things again with anybody, whether it be staff, commission members, or council members. Ultimately, my goal as a city attorney, as all of our staff at Best Bester and Krieger, the goal is to educate, to make sure you guys have the tools that you need to do the best job you can as staff, as public officials. And so I'm happy every time to go over things again. So, but I do have to say this on occasion. So, but I wanted to get to a quote again, similar to the one we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Again, the people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments that they have created. So again, just the importance of what the Brown Act is designed to do. It's designed to make sure that we are staff, we are officials, we are appointed officials, elected officials. Our goal is to do good government work. But we are only as good as we are in terms of doing that work if the public comes along with us. And so the Brown Act is designed to make sure that the public is with us every step of the way, through that open meeting requirement, through an open agenda, through notice, and all of those requirements. They ensure that the public knows exactly what's happening. And it is a positive thing, ultimately, for good government work. So number 1 answer, and I needed a drum roll, but the top 10 things you never want to hear your city attorney say about the Brown Act. The number 1 answer, which was probably more relevant a few months back, but still relevant today because we all are virtual, and that is the governor called, there's a pandemic. So what did the governor do in terms of the Brown Act? Now, there's a couple of executive orders he did issue. The first one that I'll talk about, which was actually issued after the other orders, which I'll talk about, was N35-20. This was adopted on March 21st of 2020. And this came out of, I think, one of my other cities, their county, and it's a neighboring county, but they were doing not individual, but group briefings from the county EOC, so the County Emergency Operations Center, and we may be doing this in Santa Clara County as well, but they were inviting essentially every elected official in the county to attend those briefings. Now, these were Zoom briefings where the county was talking about kind of all the emergency stuff going on in terms of the pandemic, getting status updates from obviously our health director, and getting information that's vital to get out to our constituents in terms of the pandemic. But there was an open question from staff, and that came down to the city attorneys as to whether those briefings, those group briefings where you could have a majority of a city council on, because again, it's a county briefing inviting all the electeds in the county. If you had a majority of a council on that briefing, is that a Brown Act meeting? And I took the position, and all the city attorneys that I know took the position, yes, that's a Brown Act meeting. You can only have 2 council members on that briefing. My understanding is the governor was lobbied on this issue, and he did put in an exception to the law to allow for these briefings to occur. So this exception still exists today. I know my other city and my other county is still having these county briefings, and a majority of the council is now in attendance based on this exception. In addition to that, the governor issued on March 17th, Executive Order N29-20. Now, this provision is really the heart of what we are doing today in terms of a virtual format. The governor basically suspended the teleconferencing provisions in the Brown Act. So prior to the pandemic, prior to this executive order, we were allowed to have council members call in from remote locations. Now, the requirements for that included a meeting agenda had to be at the teleconference location. Now, if we had a council member, let's say they were on vacation, you have 4 council members in the council chambers, again, pre-pandemic, and you have 1 council member calling in from, let's say it's Hawaii. If they were on vacation, we would say to them, post an agenda when you're calling into the meeting. And usually what I recommend to a council member is sit in the lobby, sit in somewhere public, but obviously quiet so that you can participate in the meeting. But again, one of the requirements was to have a meeting agenda posted at that teleconference location. And then also the agenda itself has to list that teleconference location. So prior to the pandemic, we would actually list the resort or the hotel that a council member may be staying at. We'd ask that they post the agenda at their location. We'd also ask that that location where they're sitting, participating in that meeting, that it be publicly accessible. And the reason for that is because the Brown Act would require that if somebody else from Milpitas happened to be in Hawaii and wanted to essentially address the council at that teleconference location, they would have the right to do so. So again, meeting agenda had to list the location, a posted agenda at the location, and then it would need to be publicly accessible. In addition to that, you needed to have a quorum of the body in the actual jurisdiction, which meant you could not have, let's say, 3 council members calling in from out of state. Again, you would need a quorum in the jurisdiction. So the executive order suspended all of these requirements. That now means that we don't need to have the teleconference locations for the council or commission on the agenda. We don't need to post an agenda at each of those teleconference locations. The teleconference locations can be closed private, meaning if you're at your house, you don't have an obligation to open the door to the public. You don't need to post an agenda on your front door of your home. And we would not want to list your home address on the agenda. So none of that is required. In addition to that, there's no need for a quorum to be in the jurisdiction. So the governor suspended those 4 requirements. That now means we're in a complete virtual format, and this is obviously allowed now with the governor's executive order. So a quick hypo on this, which will cover both pre and post-pandemic. A committee member is on vacation and wants to call into a meeting from his cell phone while driving in scenic North Dakota. Is that okay? Now, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, pre-executive order, no, that would not be okay. And really the reason for this is because they are literally driving on a highway, which means that we don't know the location where they are, so we can't notice it on the agenda. In addition to that, there's a requirement that the agenda be posted at the location and it be accessible to the public. Now, unless the council member has or commission member, whatever it happens to be, unless they have a clear address somehow, or if the public is, essentially chasing them down the highway, maybe it would work. But in this instance, it really would not work. But post-COVID, obviously, this is now allowed because of all the exceptions that have been granted by the governor. So just something to be aware of. Finally, in terms of the public meetings and public comment requirements based on the governor's order, there is the requirement that the public observe and be able to address the legislative body through the virtual format. Obviously, we still have to post the agenda timely, which is 72 hours for regular meetings, 24 hours for special meetings. And then with our open government requirement, obviously Wednesday preceding the regular meeting. But the notice also needs to specify how the public can observe and comment. We also have to implement and advertise a procedure for resolving essentially the ADA accommodation request, being in a virtual format, not being in an actual room. Obviously, these issues are a little more heightened in terms of accessibility and disability accommodations. And then finally, the governor does emphasize that in his executive order, that even though he's making exceptions, we need to use reasonable efforts to adhere to Brown Act as closely as possible to maximize that transparency. So again, the goal here is maximizing transparency, making sure the public is a part of the process. And so even though we have these exceptions, we should always err on the side of ensuring transparency. Now, in terms of public comment, the executive order itself was silent as to how to handle public comment in a virtual format. Some cities have obviously gone to the written email format. Some cities have gone to the full interaction on Zoom, whether it be a raised hand feature, allowing for people to orally comment and come on camera. There's obviously a big concern with this in terms of the Zoom bombing we saw very early on in the pandemic and the rise of Zoom. I believe Zoom has done a better job of trying to control some of that, but I think it's still a risk. And so there are cities that are still grappling with Zoom bombing. And just recently I've heard of a school that was teaching children where there was a Zoom bombing incident. So it's still prevalent today. And so because of that, some cities have gone to this written emailed comment format versus the full interaction on Zoom. That is the process we are using today. We do request that if you send in a written comment that it has a numerical limit associated with it, which is generally associated with the less than 3 minutes authorized for public comment. The goal is always transparency. And so with all those written comments, we do allow them to come in real time. We do allow them to become part of the meeting record. And I will add that there is some effort down, at least in Southern California, by the ACLU and kind of other public interest groups where they are challenging cities as to how they're handling public comment. Some cities were essentially taking public comment up to a set time before the meeting, but not allowing comments to come in real time during the meeting. And the ACLU took quite an issue with that for one city down in Southern California. They are still grappling with the issue. The ACLU suggested that full interaction on Zoom may be required, but we're continuing to watch that to see if that is going to be an area that they start targeting cities on. And if so, we may need to revisit how we're handling public comment. So just pitfalls to avoid, best practices in a virtual meeting format. Again, because we are virtual, there's that great risk of a desire to basically text each other, chat with each other, or email during the meeting. You want to avoid that while you're in a meeting. You do not want to text, chat, or email with your fellow commissioners or council members, or even staff for that matter, because again, that should all happen in a public setting. The public has a right at the end of the day to hear all of the people's business. Also, we want to ensure that public comment is heard, and this is easy to miss because obviously we're on Zoom. We're not seeing people in front of us in terms of council chambers and people filling up seats. So it's important that we always ask the clerk for any public comments at each agenda item. And like I said, without a live audience, it could be easy to forget that the public is there, but they are there and they are our partner in the process. And so we need to make sure that they are heard every step of the way. So with that, that is the presentation in a nutshell. I thank you all for being here, for learning today, for taking this issue seriously. This is something I'm truly passionate about in terms of open government, wanting to ensure that the city does the best that it can and complies with the Brown Act, and that we make sure our residents are ultimately a partner in that process. So I thank you for being here today. And I think we're going to take some questions and provide some answers. So Ashwini, do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Chris. We have a few questions here. So I'll start with the first one. And just a reminder, if you want to send more questions, please use the Q&A feature. You can also pick the anonymous option if you want to do that. So the first question, Chris, clearly the Brown Act applies to elected and appointed governmental personnel, but what about bodies such as homeowner association boards? These are not quite the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So HOAs are governed, my understanding, by the Davis-Sterling Act, and that is a separate statutory section in state law. But my understanding is that generally includes some kind of open meeting requirements. It may not be as extensive as the Brown Act, because obviously the Brown Act is dealing with public agencies, and the public definitely has a hand in that process based on the public funds that are used by the city that come from the taxpayers. But HOAs, my understanding, are Davis-Sterling specific. There are some limited private corporations that can be subject to the Brown Act, and I'm happy to provide more on that if there's a desire to learn more in that area.
Thanks, Chris. Next question. Where do retreats fall in here?
Good question. If it's a council retreat, a commissioner retreat, if it's sponsored by the agency, it does require a meeting agenda. It does require that we allow the public to be there. You are essentially, as a commissioner or council, if you're in a retreat, talking about issues amongst each other, and it deals essentially with city business, because the public has a right to know how their legislative body is interacting with each other, what kind of things they're learning in a retreat. So similar to the training today, if there was training at that retreat, yes, the Brown Act would apply.
Next question. Can you please explain what does the city classify a quorum? Is this 3 person or more?
Yeah, this was a question that I got also in the context of vacancies and quorums. My take is if you have a 5-member body, and I haven't had to deal with vacancies on the council because council seats are always filled for the most part. But on a 5-member body, a quorum, a majority would be 3. If we had a 7-member body, obviously a quorum or majority is 4. If we had vacancies, it all turns on the bylaws. And so if we had bylaws that indicated we only count those of the seats filled, then the quorum would be associated with the number of the seats filled, the majority. If we don't count, if we count basically the composition of the body, which would be all the seats, even if they're not filled, then that may be the quorum. So it all turns on the bylaws in terms of ultimate quorum, but for a 5-member body, just assume it's always 3. And quorum is really the minimum votes needed to transact business. But for council, where the seats are always filled, a quorum is 3.
How are special meetings defined?
Good question. There's really no definition within the Brown Act other than if for a regular meeting, it's essentially a city will adopt an ordinance. And in our case, we do have in our municipal code, essentially our regular meeting date and time. And so that's what really defines a regular meeting. Anything that's not associated with a regular date and time is a special meeting. So that would be kind of the definition, so to speak. So if council has their regular meetings twice a month, commission has their regular meetings twice a month, or a commission has a regular meeting once a month, if they decide to add another meeting, that would be deemed a special meeting.
Great. Next question. Since all meetings are recorded, who can view the recording of a closed session?
Good question. Only those people that were in that closed session. So again, closed session is confidential. If somebody wanted to listen to that tape, they would have to have been in that room.
Okay, next question. Will staff liaisons get a list of commissioners who attended today so they can make sure that all commissioners take the training? And I'll go ahead and respond to that. So we will be able to take a look at all of the attendees to the extent possible. If somebody is just calling on their phone, it's going to be hard for us to track who it is. So commissioners on here, I would recommend that you let the staff know if you attended the training, and then we'll try our best to kind of keep a record of all this. We obviously have all of the chat. So some of the commissioners did through the chat confirm their attendance. And if you want to go ahead and do that, please do so, and we'll keep that record.
The other thing I wanted to add is we are going to start talking internally about ethics training as well. So Brown Act is just one piece, obviously, of all the transparency laws that we want to be sure that we comply with as a city. And so we will be looking to do that. Ethics is the one that you want to make sure you get credit for because it is a state law requirement. So we will be looking at doing that over the next month or so. So watch out for that date, and it'll be a fun presentation in terms of the number of people we may have involved with that one.
Great. So next one says, thank you, Chris. How long are commission meeting videos saved? I use them for later reference.
That I will actually defer to my city clerk, but I don't know if she's on. So we can find out what that is. My understanding is it may be that the recordings are kept forever. So I'll find out.
Okay. And the question is from John Agg, so we can get back to you, John, on that.
Yes, happy to do so.
Okay, next question. Is ex parte communication important along with Brown Act?
So ex parte communications become important, not necessarily in the Brown Act context, more so in the due process context. And so Planning Commission, City Council, they deal with property issues more often than not. But any issue dealing with life, liberty, or property interest, the individuals that are involved in that, whether it be a developer or the public that lives in proximity to that development, they have the right to due process. And so what that means is definitely for the developer, they have the right to know every fact, every piece of information that the council or commission is using to make their decision. Now, what that means is, let's say you have everything that staff has provided in the agenda packet, but you decide to do research on your own through Google, or you have communications with somebody who may be in favor or opposed to the project. If there's information you're learning that's really not in the agenda packet, isn't being provided by staff, and it's new information that you are using to make your decision, it's important you disclose those ex parte communications, that extra research you may have done on the record, because the developer has the right to respond to that. If they think the research you did is inaccurate, they may want to dispute that, but they have the right to basically know exactly what you're using to base your decision on. And if they were to learn later that you used essentially information that was not in the agenda packet to make your decision, they can try to essentially invalidate the decision and allege that due process was violated.
Great. So if a council member or commissioner is out of the country, are they still able to take part virtually or post the international address on the agenda?
So current state with the executive order in place, I would say yes, not an issue at all, because there's no requirement that we list the location on the agenda, and there's no requirement that you actually be in the jurisdiction. So you could be out of the country and calling in virtually and still participate in the meeting. Pre-pandemic, you could be international. You would just need to list that location on the agenda, and keep in mind that we would not, we'd want to ensure that a quorum is still in the jurisdiction.
Okay. Can we have a copy of your presentation, because we're not able to remember everything in your presentation? So
yes, yeah, most definitely.
We'll post the presentation as well as the recording, and we can send a link out.
Yeah, I definitely want, if there are questions that even come out of this, or if you just want to watch it again to just, make sure that knowledge base is there, I encourage you to do so. But if there's questions even after this, we're more than happy to answer those, either through myself or Martin de Los Angeles that sits with the Planning Commission. Will
the governor's executive order post-COVID on the Brown Act eventually require legislative approval?
Good question. The governor has certain powers in the pandemic in terms of the state emergency role. So I would think that his executive order stands as is. Obviously, we don't know how long the pandemic may go on. If there was ever a challenge to his authority to issue those executive orders, then I would say yes, we may want to see some legislative action. Put some statute in. It could be a provision in the Brown Act that suspends at a certain time period, but that might be something that the state legislature explores if we see some sort of challenge to the governor's authority.
Next question, with subcommittees, if meeting on items for their subcommittee, what is the number maximum and what requires an agenda for that group?
So any subcommittee as part of the open government ordinance does require that it comply with the Brown Act. For council, obviously you have 5-member body. The subcommittees are 2 because it needs to be less than a quorum. And so if we have 2 subcommittee members essentially meeting, whether it's a standing subcommittee or an ad hoc subcommittee, that would require an agenda and Brown Act compliance, and that meeting would need to be open in public. I know commission has 7 members, but I also think we have a subcommittee that may have existed in the past or may have gone away, and that was 2 bodies as well. And so it usually is limited to 2 for the most part, because when most bodies are essentially comprised of 5. But even for planning commission with 7, my understanding is we limited it to 2 as well.
Okay, we have another, can we receive a copy? So yes, we addressed that. So next question. So when in doubt, we make sure to go through staff liaison or city attorney, correct?
Yes, so I think if you get information from a constituent or they're requesting something, the easiest thing to do is just work through your staff liaison to send that email to the staff liaison, ask them to obviously do some work, or indicate to them, look, I got this email. Is this something that you can address? Resist the urge to kind of hit reply all if the entire commission or council's on that. And then if you're city council and you have something that you'd like to delegate, obviously city manager or assistant city manager are the best people to delegate to. And then if there's questions about the law, yes, I'm always happy to answer those, and definitely feel free to reach out.
Okay, great. Next question. For the city to have rights over land development, is Williamson Act implementation required?
Can you repeat that question, Ashwini?
It says for the city to have rights over land development, is Williamson Act implementation required?
So you're testing my knowledge, and this expands beyond the Brown Act a little bit. I want to make sure we're being Brown Act compliant, but I'll briefly respond to the question. The Williamson Act, my understanding, deals with agricultural and farmland, and it's contracts that are entered into, whether it be public agency, I think even private can do it, where you basically set aside land for certain purposes. Yeah, that's something I can look into in the context of the city. I don't know if we have any land that is kind of open, vacant ag land that could be designated as Williamson land.
Okay, great. We have no more questions on the Q&A, but we have 2 questions that came in on the chat. One was, can we have a list of the exceptions?
Yes. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. We can put something together, whether it's just the statute or just a basic list, and send that out to the staff liaisons to share with commissioners, and then obviously to share with the council.
Okay, and then the next question, what are the 3 to 4 main rules one should follow at a minimum to minimize Brown Act issues?
Good question. In general, I think always consider butting up. And it doesn't need to be the same buddy for every topic, but if you have a commission member or a council member that you generally like to talk to, if you want to talk to them about a particular topic that may come up, keep that in mind. Stick with one. But you could switch topics, obviously, depending on the person, but keep in mind that budding system, because that's really going to prevent those discussions getting broader. The other thing I would keep in mind is generally when you're sharing opinions, whether it be with staff, whether it be on Facebook, whether it be an email, there's always the risk that those opinions are going to get out to a much wider audience, which may include all the commission members, all the council members. So I always encourage people to limit as much opinion as you can in kind of those settings. I know it's difficult because obviously as commissioners, as council members, constituents are reaching out to you and asking for help, asking for you to do something. But I think if they see that you've thanked them for the email, delegated it to staff so that something could be looked into, I think that would be enough to give them some assurance. If you start giving them all your opinions about the topic, about why this isn't being done, or concern about why it's not being done, that could then be spread or forwarded to the full commission or council. So just keep that in mind. I think those would be the 3 points that I would emphasize. Obviously, limiting opinions in a way that could go public, keeping in mind the buddy system, and just generally keeping in mind all the principles we learned today.
Great. I think that's the last of it. And the last Q&A, it just says a thank you to you, Chris. Appreciate the responses. So, just one more came in with Brown Act and Online Privacy and Censorship Act for social media has anything to do with principles. I'm not sure
Yeah, if I understand the question, I think it's questioning, well, how does the Brown Act interact with kind of First Amendment principles in terms of social media? Is that correct?
Yes, Online Privacy and Censorship Act for social media. I think that's what, yes.
So generally, obviously, the Brown Act wants to ensure that we don't have a collective concurrence forming, whether it be on social media, whether it be an email chain, whatever it happens to be. We want to make sure the public has a right to see a majority of its council or its commission engaging in city business. I do state to obviously all of you as elected and appointed officials to try to limit those opinions to the extent you can on social media, because obviously that could start the process of essentially a Brown Act violation. Because if it's a strong opinion, you may get another commissioner or council member wanting to respond, and you may want to entice more to respond, and then you have a Brown Act issue. But keep in mind, if it's your personal Facebook page, you do have First Amendment rights, and the city would never want to trample on those First Amendment rights. But at the same time, just be mindful of how the Brown Act interacts with that and the risk associated with stating strong opinions on Facebook, because it could elicit responses from your fellow commissioners and council members, and you might be the one with a post on your Facebook page that is a Brown Act violation.
Okay, Vice Mayor, you have your hand raised. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to thank Chris. I've been through 3 of these same workshops at League of Cities, and they were good, but yours was even better because you were able to bring in our open government ordinance, and that really made quite a difference. So I've learned even more today than all those other times altogether. So I really want to thank you for taking the time, and all the others that attended today. So I've walked away with 3 things beyond your 10 questions, but 3 additional things that I think I can put into play. So thank you.
No, thank you, council member. And I just wanted to extend my thanks to everybody who participated today. The law is challenging, but at the end of the day, it is why we are all here, making sure the public, again, is a partner in that process. And I take these issues very seriously. I went into government work because I want to see good government in action. And I'm a product of good government, growing up with not a ton of money in my life. So government did help me in the past. And so this is me giving back and wanting to make sure I think everybody on this Zoom today is educated, understands the law, and that you can reach out to me if there are questions. So thank you.
Chris, I have a question in the chat, and then I have a couple of hands raised. So I'm just going to take the question first. On submission of a written public comment, if the reading of the public comment is restricted such that it is only partially read, is that a violation of the Brown Act?
So what our agenda indicates is that we allow for public comment up to 3 minutes. We do give, or in the past, we've at least given some numerical limit suggestion to people as to how many words correspond to less than 3 minutes. It's important that we use that language less than 3 minutes, because more often than not, based on the amount of business we do see at City Council, at least the meetings, the 3 minutes get cut down to about 2 minutes on occasion. And obviously, if somebody is sending in a written comment that's 3 minutes long, it does get cut off. But so long as we are clear that we allow up to 3 minutes, which means in the pursuit of making sure that we can get done with agency business, and there is case law to support this, we are allowed to reduce that public comment time down to make sure that we can get through all the business of the night. And so if that email is cut off as part of the reading process, to me, that would be allowed, because again, we've given clear indication to the public that there's the risk that you will get 3 minutes, but you may also get less.
Okay, we have 2 raised hands. So Councilmember Dominguez, you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much, Ashwini. Thank you so much, Chris, for this presentation. I echo Vice Mayor's sentiments. It's been a couple of trainings that we've all attended, but I do still have one question. I know I've heard it before from some community members, and so I definitely appreciate the presentation. And my question is in terms of the Brown Act. So when does it, so if there's an agenda item, topic of discussion, and you have a buddy to that you're discussing this item with, does the Brown Act on that topic finish as soon as there's a decision from the council? Does the Brown Act then kind of like, do you start over? Or because one of the things that I've seen or I have questions on is, let's say there was a topic of discussion 2-3 years ago.
Okay.
And there was 2 people on the current council that buddied up. And then there was a vote. But then now you have new council members. But now are those 2 that originally started those conversations, are they locked in a Brown Act? Or does that Brown Act start over because there's a new, it's like a decision already happened?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's one that I think, yeah, I can see how public officials struggle with that. So definitely a great question. My take would be, let's say 2 people did buddy up and talked about a particular issue, and then it did get to council. If those 2 buddies ultimately share kind of what they were discussing at the council meeting, where all 5 have a chance to be a part of that process, I would say if there's no final action, let's say it's just a discussion item, and then from there's more discussion in the future, I think there could be an opportunity for those 2 buddies to kind of separate, especially if they're going to talk about something that came up at the council discussion. If they're not going back to that original discussion, it's not limited in such a way, then I'd say that the buddies could potentially change, so long as you're talking about something that was actually brought forward in that actual council meeting. Best practice would probably say, if there's confusion as to what's new, what's not new, and what's old, stick with the buddy just to be safe. But I would say if there's new information that's ultimately discussed in a new council discussion, the buddies that maybe were buddies prior in time could potentially switch if they're going to be talking about that new information. So, but when there's doubt, I'd say stick with your buddy just to be safe.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you everyone for the great questions. We're already over time. Just one last question. We have a raised hand from Fan Ha. So, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, my name is Hafan from Library Commission. I just want to take this chance to thank you, Chris, for sharing all the information. I think we never learned enough about Brown Act, and the only way to learn and to avoid is to take this helpful training. This training is so helpful to us, so informative, and it should be done a long time ago. Again, I want to say thank you, Chris. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And this is something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I think with schedules, with issues, it hasn't been done. And there is a recorded training for all of you to watch, but it is not the same as I think seeing it live in action. So I do thank you. And this is something that I think we're going to start doing annually if we can, just to make sure that everybody understands the law and that we're all aware of our obligations. But
please, yeah.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks everybody again for attending. Please have a great day. And again, if you have questions, anything you need in terms of a legal perspective on the Brown Act, I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Okay. Close out the meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.